Investigations into crimes do not always go smoothly. Every criminal wants to stay free and continue to do evil. Some cases of blatant cruelty are investigated for years. This was also the case with a young girl who was burned alive. Jessica Chambers was born on February 2nd in Clarksdale, Mississippi, USA. Her parents separated when Jessica was only 3 years old. Later, her father remarried a woman with children, so the girl had 7 half-siblings. However, despite having many close relatives, the child had a rather difficult childhood. Her father was involved in the production of illegal substances for a long time until he was arrested and sent to prison. The girl grew up in a rough and borderline environment. Her father served his sentence, but unlike most criminals, he managed to break out of the vicious circle of crime. After his release, he found a job as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. Jessica grew up in the small town of Cortland, Mississippi. You could say it wasn't even a town, but more of a village, because at the time of the events, fewer than 500 people lived there. Unlike other similar settlements, it became a refuge for people with a dark past. The average crime rate there was over 50% above the national average. Historically, most of the residents were, in one way or another, connected to crime. The young Jessica didn't care about that. She grew up peacefully and attended high school. Here, the girl performed as a cheerleader and was considered an outstanding student due to her unique abilities. At the end of her studies, she had a high grade point average. However, there were constant problems at home. The girl lived with her mother for a long time, who was in a bad mood. When she started dating a man who lived in the house across the street, her parents took this event very negatively. The woman tried to control her daughter and disapproved of her choice of partner. Due to the constant arguments, the girl was forced to move out of her mother's house. Fortunately, she didn't have to move far, as her father and his new wife lived just a few streets away. The stepmother's name was Deb, which even improved her relationship with her mother, as Jessica regularly spent nights at her mother's house. But life as a teenager was quite stressful, and then in 2012, her brother died in a car accident. The girl was very close to him, and the tragic accident was a real blow from which she couldn't recover for a long time. Nevertheless, Jessica finished school and took a job in a supermarket to support herself. She worked as a clothing salesperson. Alongside this beautiful side of her life, there was also Jessica's dark side. Sometimes she smoked illegal substances. This was one of the reasons for her arrest, but none of this worsened people's opinion of her. Jessica continued to be a kind and friendly person. Given the track record of most of the town's residents, her arrest for drug use was a minor thing that went unnoticed. However, this set off a chain of events that possibly led the girl to a tragic end. The 19-year-old Jessica was dating Travis Stanford, who was in prison at the time. The man was 28 years old, and the girl's criminal record didn't bother him. She awaited the release of her boyfriend from prison. She had grown up in an environment very closely connected to crime, not to mention the notorious reputation of the town in general. Even her own father had spent time in prison, but then led a normal life, so Jessica didn't pay attention to minor issues like prison stays. On December 6, 2014, around 4 p.m., Jessica visited her mother, Lisa. She planned to go to the gas station and return right after, but the girl was gone for a long time. The trip should have taken about 10 to 15 minutes, but even after 2 hours, she hadn't returned. Her mother got worried and texted Jessica to find out when she would be home. The girl did not respond, so Lisa called her daughter's cell phone, but she didn't pick up. Worry grew, and the woman called again. This time, her daughter answered the phone and whispered that she would be back soon and that everything was fine. This was highly unusual. Her mother was used to Jessica listening to loud music and always having noise in the background, but this time it was too quiet. This worried the girl's mother, but she calmed down since she could reach her daughter on the phone, and they had talked. After a short conversation, they said goodbye, and just a few hours later, the girl's parents faced something they hadn't expected. Around 8 p.m., 2 residents called 911. They found a burning Kia Rio in a neighborhood in Batesville. Just 2 minutes later, firefighters arrived at the scene and were the only ones trying to fight the fire. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared from a nearby forest. The firefighters turned one of the vehicles around and shone the headlights on the person approaching them. They were shocked to see a girl, completely burned and disfigured by the fire. She was so severely damaged that she was unrecognizable. The victim barely moved toward the rescuers, stretched out her arms, and pleaded for help before collapsing just 2 meters away from the firefighters. She waited there for the ambulance, unable to get up. At this point, the car was almost completely burned out. Most of the fire was in the engine and passenger compartments, while the trunk was only slightly affected. While part of the fire crew continued to extinguish the fire, one of them began helping the victim. He wrapped her in a blanket, as burns often make victims feel cold. The police arrived at the scene and spoke to the 2 boys who had discovered the burning car. They were alarmed by the victim's condition and immediately suspected that this was no accident. The girl looked terrifying, completely burned and wearing only her underwear. One of the police officers supported her, reassured her, and asked her a few questions. Most of the victim's body was covered in third-degree burns, and her hair and eyebrows were completely burned off. She could barely speak. The officer first tried to find out her name, but she could hardly pronounce the syllables. He had to lean his ear close to her mouth to hear. At first, he didn't understand her name, but then he looked closer and recognized Jessica Chambers by her eyes. He asked who had done this to her. The victim struggled to say coherent words, and the officer heard something that sounded like Eric. She then lost consciousness. At that moment, paramedics arrived at the scene. They tried to revive the victim by applying pressure to her chest with their fingers, and it worked. A resident recognized that the burning car belonged to the victim, as everyone in the small town knew each other. After first aid, Jessica regained consciousness, but only briefly. The girl tried to figure out who had been in the car with her before the tragedy. A crowd of onlookers had gathered around, drawn by the burning car. These people hindered the questioning by making noise and whispering, making it difficult for the officer to hear the faint sounds that the burned Jessica could still make. Despite everything, he managed to make out the name Eric, although he wasn't 100% sure. He asked someone to bring him a piece of paper and a pen so the girl could confirm the name in writing. But unfortunately, her burns were so severe that her hands couldn't hold anything. She could no longer move, let alone write a note. After repeatedly verifying his suspicions, the officer tried to confirm whether the name was Derek or Eric or another consonant, but nothing more could be determined. The paramedics loaded the victim into the vehicle and transported her to the hospital for treatment. On the way there, they continued to talk to her, asking her name to confirm her identity, and the paramedic repeated the officer's suspicion. When asked if her name was Jessica Chambers, she nodded affirmatively. The victim then tried once more to name her attacker. The paramedics asked if the name was Eric or Derek, but she denied both names. She was taken to Regional Hospital No. 1 in Memphis, Tennessee, where doctors fought to keep her alive. Police officers then informed the girl's parents about the tragic news of the fire and the serious condition of their daughter. They were an hour away from the hospital where Jessica had been taken. Her father picked up her mother, Lisa, and they drove together to support their daughter and find out what had happened. The drive felt like an eternity because of their worries. They arrived between 2 and 3 a.m. at the hospital. When they entered the room where the girl lay, the mother immediately recognized that it was her daughter, even though the victim was burned beyond recognition. She could not see or breathe properly. The woman bent over the crib and whispered into her daughter's ear that everything would be okay and that she and her father were nearby. A few minutes later, Jessica Chambers succumbed to her injuries. The only part of her body that wasn't burned was a small section of her neck. Given the extent of her injuries, she had no chance of survival. The medical examiners estimated that at least 93% of her body was burned, with all second and third degree burns. Almost the entire town attended Jessica Chambers' funeral. Over 400 people gathered in the chapel to say goodbye to the 19-year-old girl. Among them were classmates who had written heartfelt messages on her white metal coffin with permanent markers. They were all left with the same question: who could have done such a thing to the young cheerleader? Some thought it was an accident related to a possible car crash, but the police immediately ruled that out, as there were no traces of another car on the sidewalk or the adjacent roadside. Moreover, while the car was burned out, there were no visible signs of a collision. The police considered attempted murder the most likely scenario, especially since Jessica had tried to speak the name of her attacker until her last moments. In any case, the police made the incident public in the media. A reward of $1,000 was offered for any tips leading to the arrest of the perpetrator. Meanwhile, investigators sought out Lisa, the victim's mother. With her help, they tried to piece together the last day of the girl's life. Investigators also tried to find out whom she had spoken to and whether there were potentially dangerous people in her social circle. According to the woman, Jessica returned home around 2 p.m. and then lay down on the living room couch. After a brief conversation, the girl told her mother she needed to go to a gas station near the house. There were no landmarks in the area. The only place Jessica could have headed to was the local grocery store. Investigators decided to talk to the clerk who was on duty that fateful day. Maybe he had noticed something suspicious and could provide useful information to the police. When the investigators arrived at the store, they met Ali, who told them that he had indeed seen a girl matching the description of the murdered Jessica. The clerk cooperated with the investigation, granting access to the security cameras, and the police found the necessary footage. The footage showed that Jessica approached the store's door around 6:25 p.m. but didn't have time to go inside because someone called her name. She stopped in front of the door, turned to the side, and waved. Unfortunately, her acquaintance wasn't in the frame. After waving, she walked in that direction, out of the store and out of the camera's view. Several minutes passed without the girl reappearing in the frame. It's unknown what happened during that time, but then she returned to the door, paid for the gas, and left. The officers didn't find anything suspicious in the clerk's behavior. However, the public thought otherwise. When it became known that the last person who had definitely seen the victim alive was Ali, many thought he was the killer. Some believed he was the murderer of Jessica. Witnesses emerged, claiming he was a member of a local criminal gang. Thus, the man who had provided the investigators with the first clues came under fire from the local population. The police ensured that he wasn't involved in the massacre of the girl. He had a solid alibi. The surveillance footage showed that the man had spent the entire evening and night at work, and he had also passed a lie detector test. The investigators then made an official statement on television. The local sheriff reported that the grocery store employee had nothing to do with the victim's death. Gradually, the unrest subsided, and the employee was left alone by the public. At this point, the police already knew some details of the crime. For instance, medical examiners discovered that the girl had been doused with a chemical substance, probably an accelerant or gasoline, and then set on fire. This was the reason for her injuries, as ignited liquid is very difficult to extinguish. She burned, and there was nothing she could do about it. It's hard to imagine the pain Jessica must have suffered before she died in the hospital. Parts of her burned underwear were later found at the crime scene, sent for analysis, and it was confirmed that the flammable substance used to kill the innocent victim was gasoline. Investigators questioned one man after another, checking all residents named Derek or Eric. They also scrutinized her boyfriend, Travis, but he was in jail at the time of the attack and was ruled out as a suspect. Public opinion played a very negative role in this investigation. After the public had accused Ali, who was later exonerated, attention turned to Jessica's father. Many believed that his criminal record was enough to accuse the man of murdering his own daughter. Some witnesses recalled that Ben had expressed racist views, even though his daughter had a romantic relationship with someone of a different race. This was seen as a likely motive to retaliate against his daughter's disobedience. To clear himself of suspicion and avoid confusing the investigation, Ben was forced to take a lie detector test and provide an alibi. He then publicly stated that he had no prejudice against people of other races. Despite his criminal record, he was a loving father and would never harm his child. During this time, investigators spoke with the victim's best friend, who was named Kesha. According to her, they were together in town on the day of Jessica's death and then drove off together in a car. Before noon, they met a 27-year-old man named Quentin. They chatted, smoked illegal substances, and then drove straight to the store where the victim was last seen alive. Quentin had a less than desirable reputation and a criminal record involving burglaries and assaults on others. He had met Jessica just 2 weeks before her burning, so they barely knew each other. After receiving information about the new suspect, investigators immediately reached out to him for an interview. During this interview, Quentin was very open and willingly answered the police's questions. He said he didn't know the victim of the crime very well, as they hadn't talked much and were merely acquaintances. Quentin claimed he had met the girl by chance. She and her friend had given him a ride to the store. Naturally, he denied any involvement in the subsequent tragic events. His words seemed plausible enough, and Quentin remained calm during the interrogation. The investigators asked him if he knew anyone named Derek or Eric from the victim's inner circle, similar to the names Jessica had mentioned before her death. Then Quentin remembered a man named Derek Holmes, who had behaved strangely toward Jessica. According to Quentin, Derek had repeatedly asked her out on a date, which she declined. This also happened on the day of the massacre. When Quentin got out of the car, Derek again tried to woo her. The police were interested in the information they received. They sought out Derek, but despite some oddities, Derek didn't arouse much suspicion. The man had an alibi. On the night of the attack on Jessica, he was at home massaging his mother's feet. It sounded strange, but the woman had diabetes, and the massage helped her cope with the effects of the disease. She confirmed credibly that her son was at home. Most importantly, Derek denied Quentin's claim that he had met Jessica on the day of her death and had never behaved dismissively toward her. This was also confirmed by others in her social circle. Her best friend also insisted that Quentin was the only one in the car. This was the first time Quentin had been caught lying. He began to lose the investigators' trust. Nevertheless, the investigators had to start over and tried to gather information about the perpetrator. They interviewed about 100 men, potential suspects with the names Eric or Derek, but the investigation stalled. At the same time, public outrage grew because most of these men were black. Rumors spread that the police were deliberately trying to discriminate against local residents based on their race. The last people to be interviewed in this case were George and Mentor. Their fingerprints were taken, and even DNA swabs were collected. Mentor was of particular interest to the investigation because he had communicated with Jessica just 2 days before her death via a messenger app. Both were contacted by the police, but again, they came up empty-handed. The men had solid alibis confirmed by several people, and they claimed they weren't involved in the massacre of the young girl. They really knew each other and had been friends for many years. Despite the police's active efforts, the investigation stalled for 2 months. Investigators and the media received new clues when Jessica's cell phone was found. Not far from the crime scene, a man stumbled upon the phone while walking around the neighborhood. He turned it over to the police, and specialists were able to retrieve the last messages and calls. It turned out that the victim had sent a text message to an unknown number on the day of the attack. The man had apparently wanted to win over the girl and move the relationship to an intimate level, but she kept her distance, making it clear that she wasn't interested in his advances. This persistent admirer turned out to be the same Quentin, who had not mentioned to the police anything about harassing the victim and claimed they didn't know each other well. Investigators invited him for another interview, and under the pressure of evidence, the young man admitted to having an intimate relationship with the murdered girl. He claimed they had sex in her car several times, but no one believed him, as she had rejected his advances in their chats. Quentin, however, maintained to investigators that he hadn't been intimate with her on the night of the murder and was not at the crime scene. When the investigators searched his house, they found gasoline in his shed, though this wasn't unusual since many car owners kept gasoline as a backup. When asked to take a look at his cell phone, the young man said he had deleted all of Jessica's messages as soon as he heard about her death. Despite the investigators' surprise, Quentin casually stated that he simply didn't want to keep unnecessary information in the messenger since the girl had died and they couldn't have a relationship anymore. Suddenly, Quentin revealed that he had an alibi for the time of the girl's death because he was at a store called Fress, buying a prepaid card for his girlfriend, who lived in Louisiana. According to him, the card was meant to help his girlfriend travel to him. The police went to the store to verify his alibi, and it turned out he had indeed been there around midnight. However, Quentin was only 15 minutes away from the crime scene, so he had a real opportunity to reach the store in time to cover his tracks. Unfortunately, the investigators couldn't confirm their suspicions as they had no solid evidence at the time. Meanwhile, they decided to take a closer look at Travis, the girl's boyfriend, who was in prison at the time of her death. It was possible that he had learned of her possible affair with Quentin and therefore had the girl massacred with the help of mercenaries from local gangster groups. However, Travis was once again ruled out as a suspect, as he could not have been involved in his girlfriend's death. He was deeply affected by the news of her tragic death and knew nothing of her dubious relationship with Quentin. The case stalled again, and for 6 months, there was no new information. When police analysts reviewed the records of calls and conversations from Quentin's phone and the victims, they were able to establish that the two were indeed a couple. They determined that they were in Batesville at the same time, near the spot where the victim's car had been burned. They spoke with Quentin again, and he confirmed that he had been in Batesville. At the same time, Quentin insisted that he had arrived there much later, after the attack on Jessica, and had nothing to do with her death. His story changed several times during the interrogation. According to one version, Quentin and his friend met the girl on the street, after which he sold her illegal substances, and they parted ways. The suspect claimed he had been with a friend named Big Mike at the time. No one believed his words, as everything Quentin said contradicted the friend's testimony. When the investigators confronted him with this and asked further questions, he wouldn't confirm that he had met up with his friend that day. It turned out that the main suspect had lied to the police again, as they had suspected. When confronted about this, Quentin once again changed his story, saying that he had indeed been with Jessica and her friend in the car. They had hung out until around 7 p.m. The friend reported that they had chatted, smoked, and then gone their separate ways. He claimed he had nothing to do with her death. Despite his words, Quentin seemed shocked and very worried about the direction of the investigation. All this only increased the suspicion against him. 14 months had passed since Jessica's death. On February 24, 2016, the investigators handling Jessica's case held a press conference. They announced that they finally had a prime suspect, Quentin. The investigators said they had evidence of this man's involvement in the brutal massacre, but the public was already distrustful. People couldn't shake the feeling that the investigation was being conducted under heavily racist conditions. The arrest of the dark-skinned Quentin only fueled these rumors, which persisted until the trial of the possible brutal murderer. The prosecution was the first to comment on the trial, which began on October 10, 2017. The hearing was held in Batesville. The prosecutor pointed to Quentin as the last person to have seen Jessica alive. The couple had a questionable relationship. The girl had rejected him, and Quentin had hit on her. It was confirmed that her boyfriend had been near the crime scene at the time of the arson. According to the prosecution, Quentin attacked Jessica and strangled her until she was unconscious. Believing her to be dead, he decided to dispose of the body and the evidence by setting it on fire. To do this, he went home and got a can of gasoline from his shed. When he returned to the crime scene, he doused the victim and her car with gasoline and set it on fire. The girl suddenly woke up and managed to escape the burning car. However, the burns she sustained left her no chance of survival. The defense relied on the victim's own words, as Jessica had said a name that sounded like Eric or Derek. Quentin's name did not resemble that name at all. These were the last words of the dying girl. Moreover, the prepaid card for the girl from Louisiana had been purchased around 8 p.m., as confirmed by receipts, just minutes after the report of a burning car had been made. In that short time, the defense argued, the attacker certainly wouldn't have had time to travel the distance to the store. The prosecution then presented a map based on the recorded locations of the victims and Quentin's cell phones. As it turned out, they almost exactly matched. However, there was a known period between 8:49 p.m. and 9:26 p.m. when no phone activity occurred. The prosecution managed to pinpoint the moment when the perpetrator had gone to get gasoline. According to the prosecution, this happened around 7:50 p.m., and after a brief pause, Quentin's phone returned to the crime scene. At the same time, the girl and the man didn't exchange any messages or calls, which was suspicious. The lawyer, however, argued that there weren't enough communication towers in this town to track the location of mobile devices with high accuracy. They could be displaying false information. An independent expert was found who confirmed this. Moreover, none of the camera footage showed Quentin driving the car, and even the license plates were blurry. Furthermore, there was a text message sent from the victim's phone at 7:43 p.m., in which Quentin wished her good night and said he looked forward to seeing her tomorrow. The prosecution dismissed these claims, arguing that the messages had been sent specifically to create an alibi. By this point, the victim's best friend had already denied any relationship between Jessica and Quentin. According to her, Jessica had never liked him. After all the arguments were presented, the defense attorney made one last move that was uncomfortable for the prosecution. She drew the jury's attention to the possibility of discrimination, arguing that the investigation had largely targeted black men, treating them as suspects. The prosecution, however, denied this. According to the prosecutors, they had evidence that Quentin had repeatedly tried to become intimate with Jessica, but she had always turned him down. Numerous conversations were presented in which she had responded to his advances with restraint. Nonetheless, the defendant continued to claim that their relationship had been consensual. He even demonstrated the place and position in which they had had sex in the girl's car, but that, of course, proved nothing. The prosecution still believed he was lying, and it was in this spot that the massacre of the victim took place. Her rejection of the relationship had become the motive for the murder. After the jury deliberated on the verdict, they were unable to reach a unanimous decision. The jury was then given additional time, but even after half an hour, they could not convict or acquit Quinton. When the jury made a third attempt, they failed again, and the court was forced to dismiss the trial. On September 24, 2018, a retrial began. It was similar in many ways to the previous one, with the difference being that the prosecution called in a burn expert to examine the victim's body. The expert confirmed that the victim, due to the extent of her injuries, was unable to fully speak, meaning she could not name the perpetrator that night, and a false name had been heard. Additionally, autopsy results were presented, showing signs of blows to the girl's body. According to the prosecution, these were also signs of a struggle. In this trial, the prosecution felt more confident and was determined to convict Quinton. However, once again, the jury failed to reach a unanimous decision. Meanwhile, Quinton quietly built his life. He got married on August 8, 2015, and lived a carefree life. On the same day as his wedding, the body of a 34-year-old student named Mink Chin Yao was discovered in Monroe, Louisiana, with stab wounds in her own home. About 10 days after her death, when the body began to emit a characteristic odor, forensic experts found 30 deep wounds, clearly inflicted with great cruelty. During the investigation, checks were found, and bank transfers confirmed that the girl had cashed in some money and purchased a prescription for painkillers from a man. With this fake document, she bought the corresponding medications. Mink Chin Yao drove to the store with a dark-skinned man at the wheel. When checking the license plate, it turned out that the car belonged to Quinton. These videos were recorded just a few hours before Mindy, as her friends called her, was killed. After her death, more than $1,000 was withdrawn from her card, and camera footage showed that it was Quinton who went to the ATM. Everything pointed to his involvement in her murder. Quinton was charged with the murder of Mindy and the theft of money from her card. In this trial, the prosecution could not present enough evidence against Quinton, and he was only found guilty of stealing the money from the deceased. For this, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison. In November 2022, another trial in the Jessica Chambers case ended. The court found Quinton not guilty. The prosecutors were unable to convince the jury of his involvement in the brutal massacre of the cheerleader due to insufficient evidence. The families of both victims have yet to receive justice. The families of the murdered girls do not believe that Quinton coincidentally showed up at the crime scene both times. They are convinced that Quinton is behind the murders and are disappointed that they cannot bring him to justice. Jessica's mother died in October 2023 in the hospital. The cause of death was never determined, but it is likely that she simply could not cope with the loss and the poor handling of the case by the police. There are still dozens of unanswered questions about the deaths of the two young girls. Thank you for watching, and take care.
In March 2011, two students set out for Colca Canyon, one of the most dangerous and unpredictable places in Peru. They decided to tackle the route without a guide, relying solely on their own strength. But that journey soon became the beginning of a story that triggered a wave of suspicion, conjecture, and unexplained details. What happened in the depths of the canyon remains a mystery to this day. Testimonies did not match, evidence disappeared, and answers to the most important questions remained unanswered. Everything suggests that something far more sinister happened in those mountains than it seemed at first glance. Colca Canyon in southern Peru is a place where natural beauty borders on absolute mercilessness. Located in the Arequipa region, it is considered one of the deepest canyons in the world, with a maximum depth of more than 4,000 meters. The rugged terrain, thin air, sharp temperature changes, and unpredictable weather conditions make this region not only attractive to tourists, but also dangerous for unprepared travelers. Every year, Colca attracts both local and foreign tourists eager to test their abilities. At the same time, however, it has long had a bad reputation. Tragic incidents, disappearances, and fatal accidents have repeatedly been recorded in the area. Locals, accustomed to its whims, often refer to Colca as a place where nature sets the rules. On March 30, 2011, a young couple, Ciro Castillo Rojo and Rosario Ponce Lopez, entered the canyon. They were students and had been in a relationship for several months. Despite their limited experience with such routes, they decided to begin a self-guided journey through the canyon without a guide or an organized tour group. Their destination was the Chimpa Fortress, an archaeological site located on a hill overlooking the canyon. The route led through the towns of Chivay and Madrigal, where they replenished their supplies of food and water. Then, with backpacks and following a route marker that other tourists in the area also used, they headed deeper into the canyon. The hiking route they had chosen was relatively well known and regularly used. The trail was easy to recognize and generally required no special preparation. The couple's biggest mistake, however, was underestimating the volatility of the terrain and the difficulty of navigating at high altitude. Ciro had some basic survival training, but this could not compensate for the lack of comprehensive support in such conditions. They had no navigation devices, no satellite connection, and no emergency radio. It was a risk they took voluntarily. At first, there was nothing to indicate disaster. For the first few days, they had water, food, warm clothing, and a clear destination. According to the last photos and witness statements, they appeared calm and confident. Behind that carefree image, however, was a complete lack of an emergency plan. In an area with such complex geography, a mistake in route selection can be life-threatening. Unpredictable weather conditions, numerous rocky sections, and the danger of encountering wild animals were not fully taken into account. Later, it would become clear how inadequate their preparation really was. They did not share the exact coordinates of their route with their loved ones and did not establish a clear plan for how they would stay in contact. All they had were simple means of communication, limited resources, and the personal conviction that they would succeed. That self-deception proved to be their downfall. Against this backdrop, a story unfolds that would shake the entire country and trigger a storm of public attention. A simple excursion to a picturesque place turned into a disappearance, rumors, conflicting versions, criminal proceedings, and a deep crisis of trust between a witness and society. But the moment Ciro and Rosario descended into Colca, no one, not even they themselves, knew that only one of them would return. Ciro Castillo Rojo was born on May 16, 1984 in Lima, the capital of Peru. His family lived in Peru. His father was the respected Dr. Ciro Castillo Rojo, and his mother was Rosario Garcia Caballero. Little is known about Ciro's early years, but one thing was clear: he loved nature and longed for adventure. It was precisely this passion that determined his career choice. He enrolled in the forestry program at the National Agrarian University in La Molina, Lima. There, within the university walls, he met Rosario Ponce Lopez. Rosario was born on October 6, 1986, and was also from Lima. She was the daughter of Eduardo Ponce and Maria del Carmen Lopez. When she met Ciro, she had already gone through difficult experiences. At the age of 17, she became pregnant by a young man named Abbas. Later, despite their separation, they remained in touch. There is no information about the child. Whether the child was ever born remained unclear. At the beginning of their relationship, Ciro had just separated from a woman named Isabel. Isabel later described him as caring, kind, and very attentive. His romance with Rosario developed quickly. The couple began dating in late 2010, and after only 4 months they decided to travel together to southern Peru. They were in the final stage of their studies and wanted some time away. First, they visited Cusco, then Puno, and at the end of March they set off for Colca Canyon. Ciro was enthusiastic about the idea of climbing to the ancient ruins. Rosario supported him. The last stop before starting the trek was the village of Madrigal. From there, they prepared for the ascent to Chimpa Fortress. The path to Chimpa was well maintained. The trail was marked, used by other tourists, and under normal circumstances, the risk of getting lost was minimal. For reasons unknown, however, Ciro and Rosario left the main trail and turned off onto an alternative route. That decision changed everything. It was this change of route that led them into an unfamiliar part of the canyon from which they could no longer find their way out. On April 4, 2011, while the couple were somewhere near Colca, they were seen by 2 miners. The men were working in the area and saw Ciro and Rosario passing by. The miners later said that the couple appeared normal and showed no signs of stress or panic. In addition, Ciro spoke with them and told them where they were headed. These statements were the last confirmed indications that Ciro and Rosario were together and well. But soon everything changed. The last reliable information about Ciro Castillo Rojo dates back to April 4. On that day, he and Rosario Ponce spoke with Efrain Matos, a friend of Rosario's. They reported that they had lost their way and could not determine their location. Ciro was near Rosario at the time and was making his own phone call, but the situation changed the very next day. In subsequent messages, Rosario no longer mentioned Ciro. Now she wrote to Efrain in the first person and only gave her own situation. "I'm lost. Help me." According to her version, on the evening of April 4, she and Ciro decided to separate. She felt exhausted and could go no farther. Ciro, according to her, decided to seek help in the nearest settlement, which was visible from higher ground. She stayed behind in a relatively safe place to wait for him. From that moment on, she never saw him again. Rosario said that just a few hours after his departure, it grew cold. Night fell. She hid among the rocks to wait out the darkness. By morning, Ciro had still not returned. Without food, without clear landmarks, and without communication, she spent several days alone. To avoid starving, she said she ate grass, bark, and small insects, and drank water from streams. The greatest challenge, however, was not physical but psychological: fear of wild animals, especially pumas that live in this region, and total loneliness. On April 6, even before the disappearance was officially reported, 3 rescue teams joined the search. A total of 14 specialists were deployed. Local residents joined them. Everyone hoped to find the couple alive, perhaps hidden in a cave or among the rocks. However, no signals, traces, or voices were found in the search area. The search lasted almost 2 weeks. It was not until April 13 that rescuers managed to find Rosario Ponce in a high mountain area not far from what would later be referred to as the Sierra area. She was extremely exhausted. She received first aid on the spot. She was then taken to a Red Cross clinic and later transferred to a private hospital in Lima. Doctors diagnosed severe dehydration, weight loss, eye injuries caused by the sun and wind, and general physical exhaustion. However, there were no injuries indicating a struggle or external assault. Her condition allowed her to speak, and she immediately gave her first statement. She claimed that Ciro had gone for help and that she had waited for him there as long as possible. Her rescue became the news of the day in Peru, but the fact that Ciro had not been found and that the entire story now depended solely on her statements raised serious doubts among the public. Rosario's behavior seemed strange to many. She showed no signs of shock, did not cry on camera, and answered confidently. The media and the public noted her reserve and lack of emotional reaction. Some considered her behavior unnatural. Ciro's parents, especially his mother, could not believe that their son could have simply disappeared. They hoped that Rosario, as the last person to see him alive, would provide as much information as possible, but her account was too general and lacked concrete details. In addition, in a phone conversation before her rescue, Rosario's mother said that they had seen lights in the distance during the night and that Ciro had planned to head in that direction in the morning. In the morning, however, Rosario refused to accompany him because of exhaustion, and he left alone. This account did not match the official statements Rosario gave after her hospitalization. Soon, further inconsistencies emerged. Some details of her story changed in different interviews. For example, she first claimed that Ciro had left in the morning, then that he had left in the evening. In some versions they argued. In others, they acted together. These contradictions attracted the attention of investigators and journalists. Public opinion began to shift dramatically. Rosario no longer appeared to be a victim who had survived alone in the mountains. More and more people began to wonder whether she was truly telling the truth. In the midst of this uncertainty, Ciro's father came to Chivay and personally joined the search. Every day he met with the search teams returning from the ravine and begged them not to give up. As the police and army expanded the search area, the main task became determining why Rosario's statements appeared incomplete. She had been found alive, but the feeling that she was hiding something persisted. Time passed, but there were no results. Ciro's father sent a letter to the then president of Peru, Alan Garcia. In the letter, he asked for government intervention and for the search to be expanded. That request had an effect. The military intervened. The army provided equipment, helicopters, and specialists for high-altitude operations. Units of the National Police of Peru also joined, including investigators specializing in homicide and kidnapping cases. The number of rescuers involved in the operation increased. Soon, 16 brigades with approximately 50 personnel were searching in Colca Canyon. The search area was expanded, but the coordinates provided by Rosario produced no results. Desperate to find even a clue, Ciro's father offered a reward to anyone who could provide information about his son's whereabouts. The phone number that was made public was soon overwhelmed. Hundreds of calls came in, but none contained reliable information. Police recorded cases of false leads and attempts at manipulation. Many reports could not be confirmed in the field. Nevertheless, the father did not give up. He participated in planning new routes. He took part in negotiations with the authorities and succeeded in getting an elite police unit trained for operations in extreme conditions involved in the search. These specialists began exploring the most inaccessible areas of the canyon, including places that had never been searched before. They examined caves, rocky outcrops, glaciers, and almost vertical slopes. 1 month passed, then 2, but no clothing, objects, or signs of Ciro were found. None of the theories could be confirmed. The search became one of the longest civilian rescue operations in the country's history. Gradually, media interest faded, but Ciro's father persisted. His son had to be found, dead or alive. During that time, he repeatedly criticized Rosario's passivity, especially when she refused to return to Colca to take part in the investigation. The official reason was psychological exhaustion, but to the Castillo family it seemed like an excuse. As tensions rose, the idea emerged of filing an official accusation against Rosario, the last person to see Ciro alive. But all of that happened in parallel with Ciro's father continuing to wake up every morning, waiting for someone from the rescue team to say, "We found him." Meanwhile, investigators obtained a video recorded during the search for Ciro. In the footage, Rosario can be seen participating in a large street celebration. She appears calm, smiling, well-dressed, and shows no signs of illness or weakness. The video was recorded on the very day her lawyer claimed she was unfit to take part in investigative work. This triggered a strong public reaction. Her image as a young woman who had lived through a tragedy began to crumble. More and more people saw her as someone concealing important details. Against that backdrop, the prosecutor's office increased the pressure. Under that pressure, Rosario agreed to participate in a reconstruction of the events, but only on the condition that her parents be present. On the first day, her parents said they could not continue because of exhaustion, and the event was postponed. Only on the second attempt, at the end of August, did Rosario walk part of the route together with members of the prosecutor's office. However, no new traces or clues were found. Her behavior during the reconstruction was reserved and emotionless, which again led to mixed reactions. Additional suspicion was stirred by new statements from her mother. She suggested that Ciro may have deliberately left and abandoned Rosario in the mountains. That version, which many found absurd, was put forward against the backdrop of the increasingly faint hope that Ciro would be found alive. Despite the contradictions, the prosecution had no direct evidence of Rosario's guilt, but by then she was no longer seen by the public as a victim. During the investigation, Rosario's camera became a key element. Its existence was revealed immediately after her rescue, but the camera itself was handed over to the authorities only after a delay of almost a month. During that time, no independent experts had been able to work with the device. Only after public pressure did Rosario's lawyers deliver the camera to the prosecution. That fact raised many questions. Why was an object that potentially contained important evidence not handed over immediately? After receiving the device, specialists from the high-tech crime unit began analyzing its contents. Several details immediately drew attention. According to investigators, the structure of the stored files had been altered. 9 photos had been deleted from the overall sequence. Rosario denied in her testimony that she had edited or deleted any images. However, experts concluded that the deletions were deliberate rather than accidental. The deleted photos could not be fully recovered. Based on file numbers and timestamps, however, it was clear that the deleted photos had been taken during the Colca trip. This coincided with the time when Rosario and Ciro were in a hard-to-reach part of the route. There were suspicions that these photos might have shown circumstances contradicting Rosario's statements. Another disturbing point, according to experts, was that some of the remaining photos seemed to contain traces of a third person. The angle, shadows, and camera position suggested that not all the images could have been taken by just the two of them. This triggered a new wave of debate. Investigators began considering the possibility that another person had been involved in the excursion from the beginning. Public attention again focused on Rosario's past. Before beginning her relationship with Ciro, she had been involved with Victor Carlos Cabrera Cordova, the son of her future lawyer. 2 years after the case was closed, she married him. However, in 2011, that fact gave rise to suspicion. Some publications speculated that Victor might have accompanied Rosario on the trip, yet his possible involvement was later dismissed. Supporters of that theory pointed to inconsistencies in the photos and the deleted images as possible signs of third-party involvement. No direct evidence was ever found to support that version. No witness confirmed the presence of Victor or any other person in the group. Even so, investigators could not explain exactly who the third person in the photos might have been or why the images had been deleted. Rosario claimed she had not touched the camera after her return, but technical analyses indicated otherwise. Officially, that version remained speculation, but in the public imagination it gained increasing weight. People began to doubt not only Rosario's honesty but also whether she had truly been alone throughout everything that happened. The question of a third person remained unanswered. On October 16, 2011, more than 6 months after the disappearance near Mount Bomboya, a rescue team found the body of Ciro Castillo Rojo. It was located on a rocky ledge in a difficult-to-access part of the canyon, not far from where Rosario had previously been found. The vertical distance between the presumed point of separation and the place where the body was found was several hundred meters. The area had been only partially searched before because of the difficult terrain. The body was in the fetal position. Ciro was barefoot. He wore only socks, which showed characteristic damage. Personal belongings were found near the body, including a lighter, a hat, a scarf, and pieces of clothing scattered along the slope. A bright red piece of fabric, apparently part of his jacket, was visible on one of the rocks. That color helped rescuers identify the location from a great distance. Recovering the body took more than 2 hours. After it was recovered, it was transported to the city for forensic examination. According to the report, death occurred as a result of multiple injuries caused by a fall from a great height. Fractures of the skull, collarbone, right arm, and ribs were found. Experts concluded that the injuries were not immediately fatal. Ciro survived for about 8 hours after the fall before dying from internal injuries and hypothermia. Particular attention was given to the question of whether the fall could have been caused by outside interference. The autopsy found no signs of blows from blunt objects, no weapon wounds, and no evidence of a struggle or restraint. Forensic experts concluded that the fall was not caused by violent intervention by third parties. That official conclusion provoked mixed reactions. Investigators also analyzed the condition of the socks. The report stated that the holes were small and located near the soles, suggesting damage caused by the fall rather than by prolonged walking barefoot over rocky ground. The experts also determined that the pattern of injuries would have been different if he had fallen freely from a cliff, with multiple internal fractures and a different distribution of breaks. Even so, many questions remained unanswered for investigators. Why was he without shoes? Why was his body located in exactly that spot, not far from where Rosario had been found, and yet remained undiscovered for months? How was it possible that the body stayed hidden despite numerous searches in the same area over such a long period? Moreover, the absence of signs of violence did not automatically eliminate other possibilities. The body could have shifted as a result of a fall from a great height which might have obscured traces. The experts' report did not provide a definitive answer. The formal cause of death was recognized as an accident, a fall caused by disorientation, or an attempt to descend in search of an exit. However, for Ciro's family and a large portion of the public, that explanation did not dispel all doubts. For them, the decisive fact remained that Ciro had died alone, while the only person who could shed light on the circumstances was Rosario, whose statements had become increasingly contradictory over time. After the discovery of Ciro Castillo Rojo's body, the investigating authorities obtained crucial evidence, but this did not lead to a quick resolution. Instead, a new phase of legal proceedings began. The prosecutor's office resumed analyzing all the evidence, statements, expert reports, and digital data. The key question was whether a murder trial should be initiated, or whether the investigation should be closed for lack of sufficient grounds. In October 2011, Rosario Ponce was summoned for questioning again. It was expected that after Ciro's death had been confirmed, she would change or add to her statement. But Rosario repeated her previous version. Ciro had gone to get help while she stayed behind and waited for him. She insisted that everything that had happened had been an accident. At that point, the prosecutor's office announced that it would obtain further expert analyses and question new witnesses. In December, the investigative team requested a 120-day extension in order to analyze medical and digital evidence in detail, including camera material, witness statements, and search reports. Officially, the accident theory remained the dominant one. However, some wording in internal reports still left room for the possibility of violence. Against the backdrop of this unclear process, Rosario gave an interview to a television station in which she again commented on the events. On camera, she appeared tense. Her smile was restrained. When asked about the status of the investigation, she replied, "He just fell. It was an accident. It's terrible. But that's how it was." Those words triggered a strong reaction from viewers. People criticized not only the content of her statement, but also her facial expression. At the beginning of 2012, Rosario's defense filed an appeal seeking to have the criminal investigation dismissed, citing a lack of evidence of her involvement. The prosecutor's office, in turn, requested additional documents from the police. At the same time, an information leak occurred. An audio recording from an interrogation appeared in the media, containing statements that were interpreted as pressure from an investigator. This led to an internal review of the prosecutor's actions. Meanwhile, Ciro's parents continued demanding that the investigation go on. The father publicly accused the prosecutor's office of inaction, claiming that more than 200 pieces of evidence, including indirect evidence, had been ignored. He emphasized that Rosario was the only person who had been with his son at the time of his disappearance and that her statements remained contradictory. In his view, the case could not be closed without a full reconstruction of events and a direct confrontation between her and the investigators. Despite growing pressure, the prosecutor's office announced its final decision in September 2013. The Second Appellate Court decided to close the investigation into the possible murder. The stated reason was insufficient evidence to justify charges. That decision marked the official end of the proceedings. Ciro's parents regarded this as a personal tragedy. According to the father, the dismissal of the case was an act of judicial indifference and institutional weakness. He accused the investigating authorities of making serious mistakes and wasting valuable time. Rosario's lawyer, for his part, said that his client had been a victim of public pressure and persecution from the very beginning, and that all accusations had been based on speculation and unfounded assumptions. One of the most sensational and controversial investigations in Peru ended with no defendants, no trial, and questions no one could answer. After the official dismissal of the case in September 2013, the story of Ciro Castillo Rojo's disappearance and death was not forgotten. Despite the closure of the investigation, numerous conflicting versions and rumors continued to circulate. The main figure, arousing both interest and criticism, remained Rosario Ponce. 2 years after the conclusion of the criminal proceedings, in September 2015, photos of her secret wedding appeared in the press. Rosario married Victor Cabrera, the son of her lawyer. The ceremony took place in a close family circle. Later, it became known that Rosario was expecting a child. This news sparked a new wave of debate, especially among those who believed that Victor had somehow been connected to the events in Colca. The memory that he and Rosario had been involved even before she met Ciro rekindled old suspicions. Rosario's public image remained divided and contradictory. On the one hand, the evidence against her was insufficient. On the other hand, her behavior, the delayed handover of the camera, the deleted photographs, and her refusal to cooperate during crucial stages of the investigation raised many questions. Her interview, with its strained smile, and her participation in public celebrations during her alleged depression further undermined confidence in her account. Legally, the case was closed, but for Ciro's family and for much of the public, it remained unfinished and painfully open. Many felt that the truth remained hidden between the lines of the statements, and that no one ever received real answers. Thanks for watching, and take care. They say every marriage is a secret. You never know who you're walking hand in hand with through life. When Susan Kuhnhausen married Michael, she compared her decision to buying a car. It seemed to her that she had purchased a cheap used vehicle and found the man of her dreams, carrying little baggage from the past. But over the years, this man transformed into a true monster. Michael was extremely suspicious, and you never knew when he would explode. Susan spent most of her marriage on a powder keg. Her husband valued money and material things more than human life. One day, the woman had to fight for her own life. On September 6, 2006, in Portland, Oregon, Susan Kuhnhausen finished a grueling shift in the emergency room. After 20 years of work, she was a seasoned nurse. Now she had to learn to live independently and adjust to the fact that her husband was no longer there because their 17-year marriage had broken up. Michael Kuhnhausen, however, had completely different plans. He hired a hitman to eliminate his estranged wife. If she had died, he wouldn't have had to share his life with anyone, and his second marriage wouldn't have failed. After Susan's untimely death, the man expected to grieve until the end of his life. A brutal act is, of course, a strange way to separate, especially when a couple says "till death do us part" at the altar. The last thing newlyweds think about at that moment is how to get rid of their partner. That's how it all began for Susan and Michael Kuhnhausen. For the first few years of their marriage, they were a happy couple. Susan didn't know that her husband was mentally unstable and refused treatment. Every night, she fell asleep next to a ticking time bomb. How did the Kuhnhausen's family life end with a corpse in the house? To understand why the man suddenly became a monster, let's go back to 1988. Susan worked as a nurse in the emergency room. Her life was dedicated to giving hope to people in critical condition. Nurses in the intensive care unit had to be able to make decisions in a very short time and be sure they were the right ones. Susan was an experienced nurse and could respond to different patients individually, the critically ill, the needy, and those who simply required constant attention out of habit. She had a big heart and enough for everyone. People appreciated co-workers like Susan and reciprocated her affection. When she came home from work and was alone, the woman began to long for the warmth that surrounded her in the hospital. So, after a few years, Susan decided it was time to make sure she had a loved one waiting for her at home. For a long time, she had focused on her work, working mostly night shifts. But at some point, she wanted to socialize again and spend more time with men. In recent years, Susan mostly met with her friends, but eventually she grew bored with that. Like most people, she wanted a loving partner, but where would she find one when she spent days working in the hospital? Susan decided to take an unusual step. In 1988, she placed a personal ad in the local newspaper. She cast her net and waited for her catch. But it's hard to predict who would get caught in it, the man of her dreams or a dangerous predator. Single white woman, 33 years old, not fat, but not thin either, wants to meet someone. If you are interested in a lively, cheerful companion who wants to explore the Northwest, reply to my ad. Susan was very nervous writing about herself. She had never done anything like this before. The best candidate for Susan's heart was Michael Kuhnhausen. He wasn't a Hollywood beau, but he was friendly and attentive. The man seemed a bit rough, but he was incredibly charming and accommodating. When people meet for the first time, they always try to make themselves look better than they really are. But that didn't bother Susan. She could make anyone happy, turn bruises into smiles, as they said about her. Michael was divorced and had 2 children from his previous marriage. Susan jokingly called her chosen man a used car. They married in 1988, just a few months after they met. Susan was open to a new relationship and believed she had found an honest, worthy, and decent man. At first, everything was simply wonderful. In the spring and summer, they searched for butterflies together. In the fall, they watched birds, traveled along the Oregon coast, and enjoyed their time together. After a few years of marriage, most couples become accustomed to each other. But Susan noticed that the man she had married was increasingly changing. She felt he had become more withdrawn, as if he had suffered past hurts and was now afraid of becoming vulnerable again. With each passing day, Michael became more irritable. Clearly, something was bothering him. He began avoiding contact with his friends and distanced himself more and more from his wife. At that moment, Susan decided to do what she did best: heal someone else's soul. She convinced her husband to start therapy, but Michael didn't want to talk to anyone about his problems. For him, the best therapy was working on his sports collection. Michael owned thousands of baseball cards, autographed photos, and jerseys, which he kept in his basement. He regularly invested money in new pieces for his collection, and was convinced that he could one day sell them for several $1,000s. This collection of sports memorabilia replaced human contact for him. He spent more and more time alone, sitting in the basement surrounded by his possessions. However, the actual value of this collection was questionable. In fact, money played an inordinate role for Michael. He constantly felt that someone could take away his collection, his house, everything he held dear. Although Susan paid most of the bills and Michael also worked, he felt financially insecure in this relationship. He carefully monitored his expenses and paid attention to every detail. Michael soon found a new job as the maintenance manager of a chain of adult entertainment stores. There, he dealt with people who weren't exactly known for their decency. Later, he moved to another company, where he took on a management position. Michael was responsible for hiring, firing, and training employees. There, he was well paid, received benefits, and fulfilled his duties. Perhaps Michael was indeed a caring and loving husband at first. But associating with people from a questionable background left its mark. The first 10 years of their marriage were largely untroubled, but over time, dark clouds gathered. Michael became increasingly withdrawn, and his outbursts of anger increased in frequency and intensity. He became upset over every little thing. If his wife wanted to go to the movies with a friend, he would scold her for spending money on the tickets. If she bought more upscale groceries, he would complain about the price and loudly express his dissatisfaction. After about 7 years of marriage, Susan realized that her husband couldn't control his regular outbursts of anger. She tried to help him. She had to endure years of nasty arguments and learn to remain silent so as not to provoke her husband. The woman understood the root of his behavior. Michael had fought in the Vietnam War, and this experience had shaped his current worldview. But he never spoke about it. You can't help a person if they don't want help themselves. Kuhnhausen was no longer the happy and caring man he had been at the beginning of their life together. It was unclear where this aggression came from. There are people who are willing to blame the entire world for their failures in order to justify their bad behavior and take out their anger on their loved ones. Michael belonged to this group. He hid all of his earned money from his wife and kept it in a secret place. Time took its toll on their relationship, and in early 2006, after 17 years of marriage, the couple reached a point of no return. Susan felt she was fighting for family happiness alone, while her husband made no effort. One day, the wife simply couldn't stand it anymore and asked her husband to leave. Michael moved out of their shared home, feeling wronged. He always blamed others for his problems. Michael was convinced his wife wanted to exploit him and leave him empty-handed, just as he believed his first wife had done. In reality, Susan, tired of the constant quarrels and scandals, finally wanted to live in peace and provide for herself. But Michael didn't accept that. All his pent-up anger, disappointment, and sense of persecution were now directed at a single target: Susan, the woman who supposedly wanted to take everything away from him. This is where Michael's years of saved money came in handy. He used it as a weapon of revenge. 10 months had passed since Susan had thrown Michael out. She hoped this would be a wake-up call for him, that he would reconsider his attitude toward her and draw appropriate conclusions. She hadn't chosen a monster as a husband. Susan had married a friendly man who seemed to have only minor problems he didn't want to deal with. Over time, however, these problems became increasingly serious, and the company Michael had recently fallen in with accelerated his moral decline. One of Kuhnhausen's colleagues was a man named Edward Haffey, a Vietnam veteran with a long criminal past. Upon his release from prison, he immediately became addicted to illegal substances and now desperately needed money. Haffey stayed with friends to obtain illicit substances, and when he was heavily in debt, he simply disappeared. The man had served his last 10-year prison sentence for an act of violence against his ex-girlfriend. Haffey was known for his open cruelty and aggressiveness. Few wanted to deal with such a thug, but Ed and Michael shared the same feeling that the whole world was against them. So they became friends. First, 2 tires on Susan's car were slashed simultaneously. At that moment, the woman didn't yet consider that this could be her husband's work. Then Susan noticed that Michael was starting to withdraw large sums of cash from their still joint account. Since he still had access to her finances, Susan transferred her life insurance to her mother and brother's names and subsequently informed Michael that she was filing for divorce. The woman finally realized that her marriage was beyond saving. Around the same time, Kuhnhausen lost the job he had held for many years. Without a wife, without a home, and without a job, Michael was once again convinced that everything was against him. But in his eyes, there was a way out. If Susan disappeared, he would keep the house and a lot of money. Michael himself, however, was a coward and didn't want to get his hands dirty. He came up with the idea of hiring a hitman. His friend Edward was perfect for the role. Haffey was also on the brink at the time. He had been laid off, owed rent, and needed his daily fix. He urgently needed to raise money from somewhere, as his debts were growing every day. Haffey's desperation suited Michael perfectly. They agreed on $50,000, $25,000 as an advance, and the rest after the job was done. This money would solve Ed's problems, and in return he would help Michael. The men discussed the details of the plan and set about implementing it. If Michael could establish an alibi, the police would never connect him to Susan's robbery. He would keep the house, the money, and his collection of sports memorabilia. Portland, Oregon, September 6, 2006. Susan was home after a long, exhausting shift in the emergency room. She had planned a quiet evening. Unfortunately, her husband, Michael, with whom she hadn't lived for some time, was busy preparing a deadly surprise. Susan didn't know that the man she loved and tried to save had decided to take revenge on her by organizing a robbery. He was hiding a killer in their house, waiting for the landlady to return. Susan hadn't changed the codes for the alarm system after she threw Michael out. So he simply dictated the numbers to his friend Ed Haffey. He was not only a disgruntled Vietnam War veteran, but also an incompetent, addicted ex-con. He wanted to free his friend from his hated wife forever and solve his financial problems at the same time. He wanted to get it all done quickly and quietly. His plan was to smash Susan's skull with a hammer and a nail puller. No gunshots, no screams. To the police, it would look like a botched burglary. By the time Susan returned home from work, Michael had already checked into a coastal motel, where several people could confirm his alibi. He just had to wait for Ed's call to inform him that everything had gone according to plan. His wife was dead, and he was free and independent. Susan entered the house and went into the bedroom to change her clothes when suddenly a man who had been hiding behind the door leaped out of the darkness and struck her head and face with a hammer. The woman tried to ask the stranger what he wanted, but when she saw the open hatred in his eyes, she realized why he had come. He had come to kill her. Susan, alone with the murderer, fought desperately for her life. The attacker's confidence that he could kill his victim quickly and silently with the hammer proved false. When Susan realized he had come to take her life, she was overcome by a sheer will to survive. She finally managed to wrest the hammer from her attacker's hand. An unequal fight for the weapon ensued. The criminal was surprised and pointed out that Susan was strong. But Ed refused to give in and threw the nurse to the ground. Haffey snatched the hammer from her and attacked Susan again. At that moment, she reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out his wallet, thinking, "If I die, the wallet will be evidence." Then she began biting the man's hand, side, and thighs. When he turned slightly, she bit his genitals. He fell to the ground, hunched over in pain. Susan sat on him and squeezed his throat. She promised to call an ambulance on the condition that he told her who had sent him. But the criminal only tried to push her away. Then Susan put all her weight on him and squeezed even harder. She didn't let go until Ed stopped moving. Then she took the hammer and hit him again before running out of the house, not knowing if the attacker had survived. The woman used her years of experience as an emergency room nurse, combined with her self-defense skills, to fend off the unexpected attack of a potential murderer in a 15-minute fight to the death. She had often joked during training that she probably wouldn't remember a single technique if she were ever attacked. But the proximity of death forced the nurse to focus and emerge victorious. Susan was seriously injured, but fortunately, she survived. The paramedics immediately took her to the hospital, where she became a patient in her own emergency room. Haffey died of his injuries. He was 59 years old. A terrible man who died a terrible death. It had already become dark, and there was no news of his friend. Michael realized that something hadn't gone according to plan. He sat in the motel on the coast, not knowing what to do. When he heard news of the attack on Susan's house, he tried to call the hospital. But they gave him no information, which made him even more nervous. Despite Michael's carefully planned alibi, the police quickly figured out who was behind the attempt on Susan's life. In the basement, they found a backpack. Inside were items that someone had apparently wanted to take from the house. They included sports cards and a t-shirt with Michael's last name. The man valued these items highly, even though they had little value to others. The backpack itself, as it later turned out, belonged to Haffey. A note with Michael's phone number was also found inside. This allowed the police to clearly link Susan's husband to the killer who had attacked her in her own home. 8 days after the attack, Michael Kuhnhausen was arrested. Naturally, he tried to portray himself as the victim, but no one believed him. The fact that his phone number was found in the perpetrator's backpack was enough to charge Michael with attempted murder of his wife and conspiracy to commit murder. Shortly before the trial, Michael gave up and confessed. The Kuhnhausens had been married for 17 years. The man had known his wife well, but the one thing he had never understood was that Susan was a fighter. Michael was sentenced to only 10 years in prison. Susan, who saved lives as a nurse, now had to live with the knowledge that she had taken that very life. She wasn't proud of it, but she wasn't ashamed either. Eventually, she divorced Michael. During the divorce proceedings, the man fought bitterly for every penny. But in the end, Susan was able to keep her house and her savings. The nurse, however, lived in constant fear of the day her ex-husband would be released. In 2014, Michael Kuhnhausen had served 8 of his 10 years in prison. He was scheduled to appear before the parole board in September, and the likelihood of his release from prison was high. This deeply worried and frightened Susan. She increased her security measures to protect her life and her home from her ex-husband or any potential accomplices he might hire again. But she didn't have to worry much longer. In June 2014, Michael passed away. He died in prison of natural causes after a cancer-related illness. Although Susan admitted she felt an inner sense of relief, she was still saddened by his death. Her feelings for Michael had once been sincere. Thank you for watching, and take care. In the Mountain View Park neighborhood of Rathfarnham, in South Dublin, there stood a completely ordinary house. The former couple, their son Richard O'Connor, their daughter Louise O'Connor with her children, and their partners all lived there at the same time. The house was small, yet at least 10 people lived there at any given time. In such cramped conditions, everyday problems quickly escalated into conflicts and tension. Patricia O'Connor was a retired woman who had worked her entire life as a nurse in a city hospital. She was strict, reserved, and tired of life. She had bought the house she lived in with her own savings. It was there that she had raised her children and spent most of her life. After divorcing her husband, Augustine O'Connor, Patricia moved away for a while. She began a new relationship and lived separately, but later returned. The new relationship did not work out, and she had nowhere else to live. Her ex-husband allowed her to move back into the house. Although they were no longer a couple, they continued living under the same roof, like two neighbors. They barely spoke to each other, but shared the same living space. Augustine, whom everyone called Gus, was quiet and distant. He barely took part in household chores, avoided conflict, and tried to stay out of everything. His indifference appealed to the neighbors, but only made the situation worse. Patricia's relationship with her daughter Louise was strained. Louise lived there with her 5 children by different men. She did not work, did not help with the housework, and often argued with her mother. One of her daughters, Stephanie O'Connor, was a teenager, almost always quiet and withdrawn. The other children were younger and did not take part in the family conflicts, but lived in the same environment. Kieran Green, Louise's current partner, also lived in the house. He did not work, was irritable and rude, and constantly argued with Patricia. He did not follow her rules, did not help with the housework, and aroused her suspicions. The relationship between the two was cold from the very beginning. In addition to the permanent residents, Keith Johnston, Louise's former partner and the father of her 2 older children, regularly appeared there. He did not live with them, but often visited the house. His role in the family went unnoticed for a long time, but later it became clear that he knew much more than it had seemed. Thus, the former spouses, their adult son, their adult daughter, 5 grandchildren, the daughter's partner, and the former son-in-law were all connected to one house. Despite her age, Patricia continued to take care of the household, cooking, cleaning, and doing all the necessary chores. The others took this for granted and rarely helped. Neither Gus, Louise, nor Kieran took on any responsibility. The house became cramped, noisy, and unmanageable. Gradually, Patricia began to feel that she was losing control. No one listened to her. Her requests were ignored, and every remark was met with annoyance. She felt no longer needed in the home she had built. And although it was not said openly, that very feeling was the first warning sign. In that house, no one wanted to change anything, but no one accepted someone else's authority either. Patricia did not make demands that seemed excessive. She asked people to clean up after themselves, not to leave dirty dishes lying around, not to leave things scattered throughout the house, and to follow the rules. In return, she received silence, indifference, and lazy irritation. None of the adults took her instructions seriously, and her requests sounded like annoying remarks that no one considered important. Kieran openly avoided speaking to her. He pretended not to hear her, even when she addressed him directly. Louise preferred not to get involved. When tensions in the house rose, she withdrew or accused her mother of being too strict. No one supported Patricia. The house was in disorder, but only she tried to tidy it up. No one followed the daily routine she had established. She was the first to get up, prepare breakfast, do the laundry, and tend the garden. The others got up late, left a mess behind them, and did not respond to comments. Even the children, young as they were, sensed that the rules in that house were no longer working. The family no longer functioned as a whole. Everyone lived according to their own schedule, without regard for the others. There were no more shared conversations. There were hardly any everyday or emotional bonds left. The house that had once connected everyone had now turned into a closed space where people shared the square footage, but not the responsibilities. May 29, 2017, was no different from any other day. There were no loud arguments, no emergency calls, no recorded screams. But on that very day, Patricia O'Connor stopped leaving the house, stopped answering calls, and stopped appearing in any of the places she had previously visited regularly. None of her relatives considered her disappearance an immediate cause for alarm. The first person to speak openly about it was Patricia's sister Valerie. A few days later, while walking her dog near the O'Connor's house, she met Gus. During the conversation, he told her that Patricia had left the house with a suitcase and had not returned. According to him, this had happened on the evening of May 29. He added that Kieran and Richard had already filed a police report. This information greatly confused Valerie. She knew her sister and knew that suddenly disappearing without warning was not in Patricia's character. Patricia could not have left her grandchildren behind without telling her relatives. She had never disappeared before, was always reachable, and never made spontaneous decisions. After receiving the report, the Irish police initiated the standard procedure. They checked hospitals, hotels, and shelters. All attempts to find any lead were unsuccessful. Her bank card had not been used. No calls had been made from her phone. There was no information about Patricia's movements after her reported disappearance. Investigators asked Louise for a photo of her mother in order to launch a public search. This was the first time Patricia's disappearance became known outside her home. Until then, no one except her immediate family knew about her disappearance. The situation seemed strange. A person had disappeared, but there was no concern in the family. No one organized a search. Relatives living in other parts of Ireland began taking action on their own. They contacted each other, called acquaintances, and reached out to the media. But there was no information about Patricia's whereabouts. No one had seen her. They remembered her habits and tried to retrace her routes, but found no clues. Almost a week passed. The house from which, according to the family, Patricia had disappeared was not searched. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of conflict, and no threats. Based on the information available at that time, there was formally no reason to classify the disappearance as suspicious, but there was also no indication of a voluntary disappearance. At that point, investigators were already beginning to doubt the credibility of the family's statements. There was no exact time of her disappearance. There were no witnesses who could confirm that they had seen Patricia on the day she disappeared. Even the claim that she had taken a suitcase with her was not supported by video recordings or witness statements. The early stage of the investigation was complicated by the lack of facts and the lack of active support from the next of kin. What at first glance appeared to be the strange disappearance of an elderly person was now taking on a different shape. Behind the outward passivity lay something greater. No one in the family had mentioned that the house was under video surveillance from a neighboring property. Cameras had been installed on one of the neighboring buildings, covering both the facade and the backyard. All the neighbors knew about this, including the residents of the O'Connor's house. A few days after Patricia's disappearance, the police obtained the recordings from those cameras. Upon reviewing them, something strange emerged. On the evening of May 29, a woman left the house carrying a suitcase. She walked calmly down the street and returned about half an hour later. At first glance, it looked like someone preparing for a trip had simply left the house in a completely normal way. But upon closer inspection, it became clear that the person in the video was not Patricia, but her granddaughter Stephanie. She was wearing her grandmother's clothes and moved cautiously, as if she wanted to avoid being noticed. These actions had clearly been orchestrated in advance. The footage from the neighbor's camera revealed not only an attempt to fake a voluntary departure, but also the coordinated actions of those involved. Stephanie's recorded return through the backyard became one of the most important pieces of evidence. The attempt to create the appearance that Patricia had left the house on her own was deliberately staged in order to mislead the police and avoid an immediate search of the home. A further review of the video footage confirmed that Patricia had not left the house on the day of her disappearance, nor before it. It also emerged that family members had used her cell phone after May 29 to send messages, creating the impression that she was away. This information was not immediately made public, but later formed the basis for the charge of obstructing justice. Each of the adults living in the house had been assigned a role. Kieran told the police that Patricia had left. Louise provided a photograph and supported the version of her alleged departure. Gus repeated the same story without expressing any doubt. None of them questioned the truth of what had happened, even though no one had seen Patricia on the day of her disappearance. This coordinated silence and willingness to support the shared version became a characteristic feature of their behavior. A review of the statements also revealed inconsistencies. Louise claimed that her mother's departure was not unexpected and that there had been conflicts, but she did not point to any concrete incident. Gus said that Patricia had wanted to move away, but could not say where. Kieran referred to the tense atmosphere in the house. At the same time, something else emerged. There was no indication in the house that Patricia had wanted to leave. All her belongings were still there: clothes, medication, documents, and her bank card. This completely contradicted the statements of her relatives about her supposedly planned departure. None of the neighbors had seen her leave the house. No one had seen a taxi, a bus, or even a random passerby who could have confirmed her departure. The deception was exposed fairly quickly. After the police officially reported Patricia missing and appealed to the public, new information came in. Some witnesses reported that Kieran and Louise's behavior seemed strange. They avoided conversation, did not ask for help, and showed no sign of concern. All of this gradually formed a complete picture. Patricia had not left voluntarily. Within the first few days, it became clear that her disappearance had been staged to conceal something much more terrible. On June 10, 2017, a family that had come to County Wicklow for a picnic near the old military road was preparing to leave the picnic area. While searching the bushes at the side of the road for a lost item, one of them noticed something strange in the long grass and undergrowth. At first it was assumed that it was the remains of an animal, but upon closer inspection, it became clear that it was part of a human body. The police were immediately called to the scene. A large-scale search began. The area was cordoned off. Army units, forensic experts, and air support were brought in. In the following days, numerous body parts were found along the road, scattered over a considerable distance. In total, more than 100 people took part in the search. Investigators found the remains at 9 different locations along a stretch of approximately 25 kilometers. At first, identification was not possible. Based on body structure and external characteristics, it was initially assumed that the victim was a man. However, with the discovery of additional parts, this hypothesis changed. Forensic experts determined that the victim was a woman over 60 years old. However, no connection to current missing women cases was initially established. The absence of documents, clothing, and other personal belongings made identification difficult. The body fragments had been packed in various plastic bags. There were almost no traces of insects or animals. According to investigators, the body had been dismembered and disposed of at least the day before its discovery. The condition of the remains suggested that attempts had been made to protect them from rapid decomposition, possibly through low temperatures or burial. At the same time, the search for Patricia O'Connor continued in Dublin. As long as the examination of the remains yielded no results, no one connected the two cases. The police continued to work on the theory of a voluntary disappearance. The breakthrough came 3 days after the discovery. On June 12, 2017, Kieran Green presented himself at a police station. His appearance was disturbing. He was agitated, spoke quickly and incoherently, and constantly changed his words. He introduced himself as the partner of Louise O'Connor and stated that he was responsible for Patricia's death. He immediately emphasized that he had acted in self-defense. According to him, An argument had broken out between him and Patricia, which escalated into a physical altercation. He claimed that she had entered the bathroom while he was showering and had started screaming and waving a wooden stick. In response, he allegedly pushed her, causing the woman to hit her head and lose consciousness. He further stated that he panicked, put the body into his car, drove into the countryside, and buried it in a makeshift grave. A few days later, he allegedly returned to the same place, dug up the body, cut it into pieces, and scattered the parts in remote locations in the Wicklow Mountains so that, as he said, no one would find out about the incident. He added that he had acted alone and had told no one. Investigators listened to his statement, but treated it with caution. The first thing that raised doubts was the sequence of his actions. Kieran claimed that he had done everything spontaneously and had not planned anything in advance. However, when investigators examined the locations where the remains were found, they discovered signs of preparation. The body parts were in sturdy plastic bags, some of which had been hidden in hard-to-reach places. In addition, the medical examination revealed that the skull had sustained multiple injuries. This ruled out the possibility of a single blow. Cut marks were found on the bones, characteristic of the use of power tools. The tools used to inflict the injuries varied in type, which also contradicted his statement. In some places, the cuts were smooth, with vibrations typical of chainsaws. It soon became clear that the original burial had indeed taken place. However, the dismemberment of the body and its subsequent removal occurred later, using tools that required strength, time, and planning. All of this pointed to a high degree of awareness of what was happening, rather than a spontaneous reaction in the heat of the moment. The police began checking stores where tools used to dismember the body might have been purchased. They requested surveillance footage and bank card transactions from people connected to Kieran. In addition, the investigating authorities decided to re-examine the behavior of the other residents of the house. In light of his confession, Stephanie drew particular attention. Her appearance in the video, dressed in Patricia's clothes, had previously been explained as a harmless game. Now, her actions were viewed as conscious participation in covering up the traces of the crime. Louise's behavior was also reassessed. She knew about the conflict between her mother and her partner, but did nothing. Her earlier statements turned out to be incomplete and partly contradictory. Kieran's confession became the starting point for a broader investigation. Now, not only he, but everyone who had been in the house in the days before Patricia's disappearance came under suspicion. The crime was no longer viewed as a random event. The details pointed to the involvement of several people and an attempt to conceal the crime through coordinated actions. One of the next steps in the investigation was to examine the links between Kieran and other men connected to the family. Attention turned to Keith Johnston, Louise's former partner. Although he did not live in the house permanently, he remained in contact with her and was a frequent visitor. Investigators discovered that shortly after the murder, Keith had accompanied Kieran while shopping at a hardware store. Surveillance cameras captured the two men selecting saws, heavy-duty bags, chemical liquids, and protective gloves. When the timing of the transaction was verified, it became clear that the purchases had been made after Patricia's presumed death. This refuted the version of a panicked reaction and proved that the actions had been planned and thought through. Later, an anonymous source revealed that some of the tools may have been discarded near a river. A specialized search team combed the area and found 2 electric saws and an axe. The investigation confirmed that these items had been used for the dismemberment. One of the blades contained microscopic particles of bone tissue that matched Patricia's remains. All family members were questioned again. Louise changed her statement. While she had previously insisted that Patricia had left the house voluntarily, she now claimed that she had believed Kieran's words and knew nothing about the details. Her interrogation lasted several hours. She stated that Stephanie had only helped when asked and that Augustin had noticed nothing. Patricia's son Richard, however, gave contradictory statements. He reported that his mother had not left the house on the day of her disappearance and that the suitcase used in the staging had been found in his father's bedroom. Richard's testimony was important because he was the only family member not involved in the cover-up. He confirmed that Louise had prevented him from going to the police, insisting that their mother had simply left. This behavior finally convinced investigators that the concealment of the crime was not limited to one person. The police compiled a list of all the additional locations where the remains had been found and officially recognized them as crime scenes. In addition to the house, wooded areas, the original burial site, and the road along which the body parts had been transported were documented. The picture was now complete: murder, dismemberment, transportation, a staged disappearance, and a mutual agreement to remain silent. In January 2020, the trial for the murder of Patricia O'Connor began in Dublin. 5 people appeared in court: Kieran Green, Louise O'Connor, Stephanie O'Connor, Keith Johnston, and Augustine O'Connor. They were all charged with various crimes. They were accused of different forms of involvement, ranging from committing murder to concealing evidence and obstructing the investigation. The judge warned that the trial would be long and complex, with a large amount of evidence to be presented. The prosecution presented a complete chronology of events. According to their version, Patricia died in her home on the night of May 29. Kieran struck her several blows to the head, inflicting fatal injuries. The body was then hidden, later dismembered, and taken to remote areas. The staging of her disappearance began that very day. Stephanie dressed in her grandmother's clothes and was captured by a street surveillance camera. The suitcase used in the staging was later found in the house, definitively refuting the version of a voluntary departure. The defense immediately took a defensive stance. Kieran, who had previously admitted guilt, changed his statement in court. He claimed that he had not committed the murder, but had only agreed to take responsibility at the family's request. He named Augustine as a possible murderer, claiming that he had argued with Patricia and then hit her with a crowbar. According to Kieran, after the incident, Louise had convinced him to take the blame and promised him support in return. This turn of events was unexpected, since Kieran had maintained a different position for more than 2 years. Louise refused to confess, claiming that she knew nothing about her mother's death or Kieran's actions. She explained Stephanie's involvement in the staging by saying that she had believed her partner's words and saw no reason to doubt them. The prosecution presented Richard's statement, in which he pointed to his sister's active role in covering up the crime. The prosecution also presented video footage showing Kieran and Keith purchasing saws, bags, and other materials. It also showed footage of the car used to transport the body parts. Separate medical reports were submitted, confirming multiple blows to the head and traces of dismemberment carried out with electric tools. This contradicted the claim that the death had been accidental as the result of an attack. During the trial, the defense attempted to shift the focus to the alleged unreliability of the video evidence. However, the court rejected those arguments. There were also attempts to shift blame onto the other defendants. Each defendant tried to downplay their role. Kieran blamed Augustine, Louise, and Keith. Louise blamed Kieran. Stephanie claimed that she had acted on her mother's instructions. Keith insisted that he did not know what the tools had been purchased for. Augustine claimed that he had simply believed his daughter's words. The prosecution emphasized the consistency of the actions and the coordinated lies supported by all family members. The court heard testimony confirming that the household knew about Patricia's death, but concealed this fact through coordinated actions. The conclusion was clear. It was not an impulsive reaction to a coincidence, but a collective attempt to cover up the traces of the murder. In February 2020, the court found Kieran Green guilty of murdering Patricia O'Connor. The aggravating circumstances included the absence of signs of self-defense, the dismemberment of the body, and the attempt to obstruct the investigation. He was later sentenced to life imprisonment. Stephanie O'Connor, the granddaughter of the deceased, was sentenced to 18 months in prison. She was found guilty of misleading the investigation by participating in the staging of Patricia's alleged departure. CCTV cameras had captured her wearing her grandmother's clothes and carrying a suitcase. The defense insisted that the daughter had only been following her mother's instructions. However, the court assessed her actions as deliberate and purposeful. Louise O'Connor was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. The court found that she had obstructed the course of justice, coordinated false statements, and concealed evidence. The sentence was justified not only by her involvement, but also by the pressure she exerted on other family members, including attempts to prevent her brother from going to the police. Louise denied the allegations, but none of her explanations matched the established facts. Keith Johnston, Louise's former partner, was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Video footage shown in court confirmed his involvement in purchasing the tools used to dismember the body. The court found no evidence of his involvement in the murder itself, but did note that he had contributed to covering up the traces of the crime. Before the trial began, Augustine O'Connor admitted that he had withheld information about the true circumstances from the police. He confirmed that he had known about Patricia's death, but deliberately maintained the false version that she had left the house. For this, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Taking into account his age and his partial cooperation with the investigating authorities, the court ruled that he could serve his sentence with the possibility of suspension after 1 year. The actual prison terms differed from the sentences imposed. Stephanie was released after only 8 months. After her release, she made no comment and withdrew completely from public life. Augustine spent approximately 13 months in prison and was then also released. Louise was released in 2022 after serving almost 2 years. Keith was also released in 2022. Media reports described his public appearances, but his behavior showed no sign of remorse or distress. Thus, Kieran Green is the only one who continued serving the full weight of his sentence. He is serving his sentence in a maximum security prison. The likelihood of his release is extremely low. The court found that the actions of all those convicted were not aimed at helping, but at covering up the crime. Despite their varying degrees of involvement, all the adult family members connected to the house contributed to disinformation and an attempt to evade responsibility. Patricia O'Connor was buried without public announcement. The funeral service was closed to the public. Only a few family members received an invitation. None of the deceased woman's sisters were informed. The relatives learned about the funeral from the news after it had already taken place. Former colleagues, neighbors, and acquaintances from her hometown were not allowed to attend the ceremony. The decision to hold a private funeral was justified by the need for privacy. However, it later became clear that this was a continuation of the attempt to isolate Patricia's memory. The exclusion of next of kin from the funeral confirmed the rift within the family and showed that some of those involved continued to distance themselves from the opinions of others even after the trial. After his release, Augustine O'Connor inherited the house where Patricia had died and gained access to her bank accounts. A few months later, he sold the property for a large sum. Although Louise was her daughter, she received nothing from the estate. Her name was not even mentioned in the official obituary. According to Richard, their father accused Louise of moral violence and deliberately excluded her from his will. By the time of his death in 2024, Augustine had not reconciled with his daughter or grandchildren. His final decisions only confirmed that he had definitively distanced himself from those involved in this story. After his release, Keith Johnston spoke almost not at all about what had happened. Photos of him taken by paparazzi appeared in newspapers. In them, he looked calm, showing no signs of remorse or distress. Many felt that the sentences imposed on him and the others were too lenient compared to the gravity of the crime. A public memorial service in honor of Patricia O'Connor was not held. Her name appeared neither in city chronicles nor in public initiatives. Those who had known her before said that she had dedicated her life to caring for others, but ended in loneliness and betrayal. The story ended with court sentences, but it did not provide a complete answer to the most important question. None of the condemned ever explained why they considered it permissible to eliminate Patricia. The most horrifying part remained incomprehensible. How could the family to whom she had devoted her life decide on her destruction? Thanks for watching and take care.